They've stood the test of time, and today ruins like these are our windows to the past. On St. Croix, ruins can be found at almost every turn, each with its own purpose and story, attracting the curiosity of everyone who sees them. But today's show will focus on building structures that are still intact and functional. We'll learn of their historical significance here on St. Croix and trace back their connection to the United States. The first house up on our tour, Estate Garden. Tucked away on St. Croix's South Shore, the Estate Garden Bay Great House was built in 1748, during a time of great sugar prosperity on the island. The house, along with the more than 200-acre sugar plantation that surrounded it, was originally owned by 3 generations of McAvoys, Scottish-Irish planters who lived on island during both the French and Danish colonial periods. Now, like other great houses on St. Croix, the Estate Garden Bay Great House exhibits a neoclassical architectural style. But what sets it apart for some is its condition and its connection to the nation's capital. Now, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about this house that looks very familiar. Now, to help us with this and give us a tour of this beautiful estate is Bill Taylor, one of 2 architects that did restoration work on the house. Hi there, Janeisha.
Nice to meet you, Bill Taylor.
Nice to meet you. So what's in store for today?
Well, we're at a really significant site, historic site, which represents the architecture of its time and place, and also the effort to restore it. And it's an interesting story, and it's one that's especially Crucian.
Okay.
So I think this is going to be interesting for your viewers.
It's important to note that this house was destroyed by a fire in the early 1900s. It stood in ruins for some 40 years until it was rebuilt. In 1985, Richard Jenrette, a collector of historical houses and artifacts, bought the property and hired Bill Taylor and Danish architect Frederick Jessing to restore the house to its historical origins.
In England, during the 18th century, there was a kind of intellectual eruption of thought that involved not just architecture, but politics and religion and philosophy and science.
Okay.
And neoclassical architecture, especially Palladianism, which is a certain form of neoclassical architecture, was thought to be the embodiment of those principles for various reasons. Now, this building may look super fancy,
That's true.
but in fact, it represented a kind of a simple neoclassical version that represented the high ideals of the time. And even though we say this is Palladianism, and it really is an example of English or Anglo-Palladianism, it was a style that not only found resonance all throughout Europe, but as I'll point out later, this had a tremendous impact on American colonial architecture.
And that influence and impact came from William Thornton, a one-time resident of the island who studied neoclassical architecture in Europe, and is a major link between this house and another famous national structure.
Thornton, he actually went on to the States in 1788, became a citizen, won architectural commission, so he was completely well-trained and versed in Neo-Palladian architecture. He won a big commission in Philadelphia in 92, and in 1793, he won the commission for the United States Capitol, which was really the more important building of the 2, the Capitol and the White House. But the building that we see now is still a reflection of the architect who lived here, who was a doctor, and had a botanical garden at Grove Place.
Oh, so Thornton had a botanical garden here on St. Croix and Grove Place.
Yes, and he was here during the construction. So the fact that there are these elements of sophistication, these small differences in dimensions, for instance, and the fact that it's such a pure version of Anglo-Palladianism, and the fact that he was a good friend and present, it seems unmistakable that his hand was here. So I think in a sense America can thank us for the Capitol and perhaps the White House.
Great.
Because the architect of the White House, who also studied the same sources in England, his name was James Hoban, he actually worked as a supervisor on the Capitol building. So Thornton and Hoban were connected. So there's a real connection here. And there's about a 10-year difference between the ages of those buildings and this.
It started all from here.
In a sense, it did. Well, it started in Italy, and then it went to England, and then it came here.
Follow the trade winds.
Right, follow the trade winds, exactly.
Well, now that we've uncovered the connection this house has with the U.S. Capitol and White House, let's take a tour of the inside and see what other interesting things there are to learn about this home. The first room we enter is the receiving room. Now, this room is quite larger than that of the original home, but what's the same is the form and function. It wouldn't screen to the rest of the home.
Physically, as a receiving room, perhaps somebody would come here and leave a calling card and wait, and then be brought into the main salon. So socially it had a function, but also it makes this a more complex architectural room, and here we see this neoclassical detailing, very rich, and these Tuscan columns which reflect the stone columns of the porch. These are actually mahogany.
Oh.
And the mahogany was typically painted except for the furniture, of course, and the doors. So the fact that it's mahogany painted is not a problem for a preservationist because the wood is tropical and it's easy to shape. And so that was the wood of choice. We couldn't use pine or oak.
Okay, now you're talking about mahogany. I've
Uh-huh.
heard that you guys have one of the largest private collections here in this house.
Well, each room has some. I don't know how it compares in size, but of course the quality reflects Mr. Jenret's keen eye and interest. And so he has a team that searched out these elements, and that's why it looks of a piece. You know, the building and the furnishings and the setting are really all of one. One of the things you can see from this room that you can't see from the salon is above the cornice, which is a very deep and rich molded element. You can see a space there. You see that?
Yes, I do.
And there's also a space here, Janeisha. Can you see that? You could stand up on this chair. I'm kidding. But do you see it here?
Yes, I do see it. It's kind of short here, but
Right.
I do see it.
Well, I would help you with that. But the idea of this is that these ceilings above are all connected. And so even with the windows closed, warm air rises up, passes through this ventilator,
Oh, yeah?
and it goes out of the porch ceilings. So with everything closed off, it's still vented.
Wow.
And for hurricanes, of course, you know, the issue of generating pressures inside the house are eliminated by this device. And this is the device that you see in the St. Thomas Synagogue. The
Okay.
St. Thomas Synagogue is vented all the time by this natural passive convection. It goes up and it goes out. And you could see it in this building, in this room. It goes all the way around the building. So that's one of the reasons it's so comfortable in here without any air conditioning.
Okay, so where exactly are we standing right now? I would probably call this the living room of my house. But what is
Well, that's not quite grand enough.
Yeah, it's not.
So this is perhaps the salon,
The salon.
or the main entertaining room.
Okay.
And this is probably reflective of the way the original floor plan worked. And you could see Mr. Jenret has hit home runs on these furnishings, this beautiful brass chandelier.
Very detailed. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
and it's perfectly in scale with the room. So this would have been of the same period. It didn't necessarily come from here because the room had a different character in the 40s. But the end product we think is authentic as far as it could have been made without having actual interior photographs of this at the time before the work was done. You know, we get the quality of construction that's equal to the original work. You know, the original work was done by freemen who had become tradesmen. The building itself represents not just this European influence and theory, but the workmanship was done by people from here who were trained and in many cases bought their freedom through their talents. So the building itself represents a kind of a symbol of emancipation to me, because these were local fellows, and they took some of these elements and they put them in their own modest cottages. And you could see some of these if you look around St. Croix. Well, here we have this sumptuous dining room, and you can see it's in scale with the rest of the house. It's a large and grand room, and this is probably the size of the original dining room. It had a stair introduced into the corner of the room in the 40s, in the reconstruction, which sort of took away about a third of the space of the room. But we knew it wasn't original, so we took that out. But here we have a magnificent display of period furniture. We have Crucian wicker furniture here, mahogany, and some of the pieces I think Mr. Jenrette acquired from the Walls when they sold the property. I believe this oval mirror is part of that legacy, and you can see it's a beautiful piece. The crystal chandeliers were a reflection of increased prosperity. So we think of chandeliers as typically brass, and some of the churches have those. But as the estates became more prosperous, the crystal was a kind of a reflection, let's say a status symbol.
Adjacent to the grand dining room is the kitchen. It's not as elegant as the other rooms, but it's quite charming. It was once the pantry, now it's a fully functional kitchen, decorated with stone and marble finishings and accentuated with windows that go all the way down to the floor. Now, if you're wondering about the windows, they keep the kitchen cool by allowing the heat to escape faster. And like the north front side of the home, the back south porch area is just as charming and attractive. With its columns, stone floor, and arches, it's a true work of Palladian architecture.
Downstairs here would have had cisterns and storage rooms, and maybe servants' quarters, and maybe guest rooms initially. And so we turned this into a more comfortable guest area. And as you can see, we have marble floors, and this kind of checkerboard pattern is something that you see in Christiansted, sometimes with gray and white stones, but black and white is kind of fancy.
Yeah.
So, and so now it's pretty comfortable, and with all this cross ventilation, it's very nice here. In fact, one of the keys to the stair was that we saw this vent. It wasn't open, but we could see the outline of this sloped wall vent. So there was some indication that that wouldn't have been a vent into a closet.
That brings a lot of...
It brings a lot of air, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Well,
It's closed right now, but
yes,
it can.
could. And this serves as a hall for the downstairs, and there are separate entrances. Guests don't have to go through the main floor. They can just exit out into little garden areas and maintain a little bit of privacy. But again, it's beautifully furnished, and again, this is more sumptuous than the downstairs would have been as a kind of utilitarian space, but it's very comfortable. a part of St. Croix, and thank you, Channel 12, for your interest. And in a sense, this is the landscape here. It's one slice, but it's really important. And in a sense, it belongs to everybody.
Yes.
So thank you for your interest, and thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's so hard for me to pull away from this beautiful house, but there are more historic sites to see on this house tour. So let's keep it moving. From this beautiful Estate King Garden Bay house, we travel west to Estate Butler Bay, another well-preserved historic estate. Like the King Garden Estate, this Butler Bay site was also a sugarcane plantation. To show us around is Mike Hartledge, a caretaker for a section of the estate.
From what I know so far, I've been here about 3.5 years on the property itself. Currently it's divided into 2 different owners. On this side, on the south side of the road, it's owned by a company from the Bahamas named Twin Pine International Holdings, and it's roughly 10 acres, and it consists of this house, which is, we call the baobab house because of the baobab tree that sits in front of it. This was originally a caretaker's house for the Butler Bay plantation. To the west is the sugar factory, which we'll see later, and to the south of us is the old sugar mill that used to power, or used to grind the cane. And at one point, is its largest, I believe it was 360 acres. It is one of the larger estates on the island. Across the street is the Butler Bay Plantation, as it's called now. It's the property, it's 14 acres, I believe. It's owned by a man named Gary Lawler. Mr. Lawler's a fantastic gentleman that's painstakingly restored all of the buildings over there. It's the original great house, the original cookhouse, one of the carriage houses, the overseer's house, the hospital, 3 or 4 of the slave ruins. It's beautiful.
Now that Mike gave us an overview of the estates, let's get a closer look at the different structures.
Well, it's my understanding that back in 1760, when the house was built, that the great house was still under construction. Apparently in 1747, the property became independently owned. This house was originally used kind of as a manager's house during all of those times. There's an old slave building behind it. At one point it's been used for many different things. But it was a cookhouse, it was a slave house, it was a little bit of everything. There's another portion on the house which has since been converted into a bedroom that was almost like an outdoor dining facility. It had 4 stone posts and a roof over it where everybody, all the workers would gather during the day to eat the meal. Inside the house, mainly it was used as the managers or overseers or caretakers, depending on what stage of development the plantation was in. But like right here, I'm told that this is where a water pump used to stand, a hand crank pump from a cistern, and this used to be where the blacksmith would work before it became a cistern for the house later. So it's got many different uses. All I know is it was here in 1760. It's still here. It's still square. I live in it and love it.
Near the Baobab House are the ruins of the rum and sugar factories.
This is the combination sugar factory and rum distillery. It's one of the few estates on the island, I'm told, that had both. Some had one or the other, but very few of them had both of them under the same roof. This is a T-shaped building, if you could look down on it from above. And the portion that you can see here is where they did the rum distillery. There were 3 stills in there at one point, 2 300-gallon stills and one 250-gallon still. And then there was a second floor, and that's where a lot of storage took place and the different tools of the trade that you needed to keep dry. From what I know is behind us is the sugar mill. The cane would come in raw. It would be the power generated by the turbine spinning through the wind would crush the cane. The sluice run would come from the mill down into the factory, and the sluice being the juices that were squeezed out of the cane. Okay, now as that came into the factory, it went through a series of distillations where it it was put into giant coppers and then boiled. And at each stage, from each copper as it transferred to the next, it was at a different processing point or a different level of purity. The final stage being the actual white raw sugar. There's something, I believe it's called portit or portite, that's the stage right between molasses and sugar. That is how most of it was exported back to Denmark.
And this is a sugar mill. It's now more of a centerpiece for a guest house. This picture shows what the area looked like in the early 1900s. Adjacent to the sugar factory is the second Butler Bay property. It's currently owned by Mr. Gary Lawler and consists of what was once an overseer's dwelling, slave quarters, stables, and a great house.
This is the great house. This is where everything, was run from. This was where the owners lived, and as on the bottom floor you'll see the stables where the horses were kept. Then up above that there's a living room, a dining room, a bedroom, a bathroom, and there's a separate building over that's got more bedrooms in it, and then off to the right again is the original kitchen. But this house has been painstakingly restored. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's one of the things that I think makes Butler Bay so special in itself is the fact that this is like walking back in time. You've got the ruins showing everything. You've got, the plantation pretty much the way that it was back in the day. It's very typical of the early designs and construction methods used. It's very unusual in the fact that it's still pretty much the way that it was. The current owner's gone to great lengths to make sure that happened. Even in the dining room there's a candled chandelier instead of an electrical chandelier.
Even the horses and the number of horses on the property are authentic and to historic accuracy. They are the closest breed to the Pacifica horses, which the plantation owner had at the time. Unfortunately, due to privacy concerns, we were not able to film inside the great house. But as you can see from the outside, it was and still is an amazing piece of architecture. Okay, back hundreds of years ago, where would we be right now? What would we be standing at?
We're in the middle of the provisional field.
Okay.
It's my understanding that generally the elevations below the sugar mill were used for provisional planting. That way the cane didn't have to be carted up a hill. Everything was brought down to the mills. Everything below it, like where we're standing now, is where they used to grow the food to feed the plantation workers.
Okay. Now what's this building behind that we see behind here?
The two-story one you see back here, that's the old overseer's house. And below it, I think they used as supplies, as stables, hurricane protection, jail, a little bit of everything. And then you'll notice off to the right there's an old slave ruin, or slave quarters ruin. At one point there were around 30 of those from there to the existing road and the end of the driveway, and they called that the village.
Now surrounding the great house and sugar factory area are other interesting structures. Take for example this ruin at the westernmost point of the property. At first glance, it simply appears to be a ruin covered in overgrown brush and vines, but it is said to have once housed one of the more famous and significant U.S. poets.
You see the building back there in the back. At one point that was, like I said, it's been many different things, but one thing I know for sure is in 1776, the poet that I was speaking about earlier, Phillip Frenaue, lived here, and he wrote, while living here, he wrote The Beauties of Santa Cruz and 4 or 5 other poems. At the same time, he was writing poems about the Revolutionary War back in the States.
In fact, Frenaue is credited by Thomas Jefferson, one of the nation's founding fathers, for, quote, saving the Constitution of the United States. Other interesting structures are this limestone kiln and this water trough for animals, which is hidden by overgrown brush.
Here's an old watering trough that's kind of formal in my opinion, but it looks really good now. They would bring the animals up here to water, and then they would draw the water from a well down here You can see it's still kind of interesting to me because there's steps leading down into the well to make it easier to get the water out to put it in the troughs for the animals. And I've got a picture of how it looked in the late 1800s that I'll make sure that you see.
And this is the picture. It's no secret that this island is rich in history, but what does remain a secret at times are the stories that come from places like Estate King Garden Bay and the Butler Bay Estates. Thanks to Mrs. Jenrette, Lawler, Bill Taylor, and Mike Hartledge for their time and generosity. And until next time, remember to cherish your home, this beautiful island, but most of all, cherish each other.